Hi everyone. So xParticles, if you're not an xParticles user, it is a plugin that lives inside Cinema 4D, and it helps artists create fantastic particle effects, but also we have lots of other fluid and physics solvers, which means this is great for motion graphics, good for visual effects as well, and it is now, with our new update, fully working inside the fantastic Cinema 4D R20 with all of the amazing new features that Maxon have brought in. xParticles is fully compatible with those. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm just going to dive in and show you some of the new xParticles features up and running, working in Maxon's R20, and demonstrating how this can be integrated into your motion graphics or even VFX workflow to help you make stuff look nice. So let's crack on. I'm going to just play you this render. Now, this was rendered by our fantastic artist, Mario Tranfuc, who is an incredibly talented guy. And he literally finished this on Friday morning before I got on my plane to come to IBC. So this is demonstrating, and this is going to be a kind of theme of what I'm talking about today. It's mixing our physics solvers. So we're not just going to be solving for fire and smoke. We're going to be solving for fire and smoke and mixing it with water, or with grains, or with more constraints. So here's the render. So we've got this really nice fluid simulation, which is the molten metal. And what we're able to do with xParticles is then emit fire from that fluid simulation, which is giving us the flames and the smoke. And then we're using other physics within the system to get these really nice little spark elements, which are jittering about, and using our VDB meshing tool to get these fantastic kind of bits of metal that were once molten and have solidified in the mold. So that's one of our renders that we'll rebuild during this presentation. And also, let's have a look at this one. So now we've rewritten our fluid solver, and it is 3.5 times faster than the previous version of our fluid solver. So it's much better to work with. And it also has a fantastic grain system. So we can do sand, granular, snow, ice animations. And again, this is kind of a multi-physics scene because we've got our fluid solver creating the sand, but the movement is being created by particle advection. An explosion, which we can't see in the render, is driving that movement forward. So again, we've got two physics solvers working together to get this really nice movement. All of these scenes are rendered in our plugin Cycles 4D as well, which is a bridge. So Cinema 4D users can use Blender's Cycles render engine right inside Cinema 4D, working in R20. It's fantastic. So we're going to have a look at that. And also, I'm just going to show you, before we dive into the software, a couple of kind of hardware renders of the fluid solvers, different looks that you're able to achieve. So again, on the theme of mixing physics, this one. So here what we have are two solvers being mixed. We have got a fluid solve, which is the waterfall coming down, but then we have got this kind of slushy snow. And what's going to happen is it's going to get engulfed by the water and start mixing into this same fluid simulation. So as it comes down, it grabs it, it breaks up, there's some clumps left remaining, and it all becomes congealed as it makes its way down towards the bottom of the simulation. So let's dive in. So here we are inside Cinema 4D R20, and I've got a very simple scene setup. So xParticles is a plugin, and once you install it, you get all of these menu items, and once you start using it, you'll find that it feels very similar to using the MoGraph tools inside Cinema 4D. It's very intuitive. So if you know MoGraph already and the use of cloners and effectors, you will pick up the xParticles workflow very quickly. It's very similar. So if I hit play on this scene, it's going to look rubbish. All I've got is one particle emitter emitting loads of blue particles, and it doesn't really look like fluid at all. And what's happening is, if I just open up the xParticles system, we have an emitter, and they are colliding with this plane that's got a collider tag, and they're sliding down. So what we have to do to make this start behaving like water is switch on the physics for water, the fluid solver, and it's called xpFluidFX. So if I just switch that on, I don't have to link it to anything, I don't have to parent it or attach a node, it just lives in the scene, particles will start behaving in a fluid-like way. Press play, and straight away, the fluid solver is doing its magic, and it's making all of those particles interact with each other in a physically accurate way to simulate water flowing down this surface. Now, I talked about how it's very similar to using MoGraph xParticles. It actually works with MoGraph very well as well. So, at the bottom of this scene, this cube here is the geometry that the particles are sliding down. That cube is just this cube. And what I've done, I've put it inside a connect object. And the connect object has the collider tag to say collide with the particles. So if I drop any object in that connect object now, it'll be a collider object with the fluid. So if I just activate this cylinder, there it is in the middle, and it is under the connect object. So now this will start interacting with the fluid, and it should bounce off it. That's working nicely. And now if I put that inside a cloner, a MoGraph cloner, because it's all under the connect object, these are going to interact with that fluid solver as well. And there's just a simple random effector set to noise on the cloners, so they're animating in real time. This is all playing in pretty decent speed in the viewport, and all the physics are working with each other. So this is really useful, this integration. If you've got previous scenes that are built, which might benefit from a bit of fluid solving or fire solving, you can just throw them in and try it, and everything should really work. Okay, so I'm not going to go into massive detail about how to set up fluid solves, because I'd need 6 hours and I would bore you to death. That's something that you need to do in your own time, and we're going to have loads of tutorials and training online to help you out with that, but it's not good for a live presentation, trust me. But what I will do is give you the basics, and the basics are this. In the fluid solver, you'll see there are very few parameters. That's it, hardly anything. And what the fluid solver does, these settings dictate how accurate the solve is. So if we've got it on accuracy fast, this is a preset, this means you're going to get really fast visualization and you're going to get nice speed in your viewport, but the simulation isn't that accurate. And it means things like complex collisions might not work correctly because it's just not got enough substeps and iterations to work with, but it's really good for previs. But then if you want to, you can increase this to a higher number, and this is going to automatically set more iterations of substeps, make it more accurate, but it'll run more slowly. So if you've never used SPH fluid solvers before, use these presets. And if you want it to do quickly, put it on fast, and if it doesn't look right, gradually put it onto their medium or high or even accurate until you get the accurate solve that you need, and that's all you need to do. If you've used fluid solvers before, you can go into custom, and that opens up all of the settings where you can say how many iterations and substeps are used and why you would use them and the thresholds and all sorts. But mercifully, if you're lazy like me, you can just use these presets and they work great. All right, so that's just the accuracy of the solve, and that's all you do in that. But where you can start changing the look and the flow of the liquid is actually in the emitter itself, the thing that's spitting out the particles. So if I go to my emitter, go to the extended data tab, I've got a fluid data. And again, there's not that many parameters here. But what I'll show you is, at the moment, we've got this set up just to be a nice liquid. If I ramp up the viscosity, it'll start being a bit more gloopy. And you'll see this, especially when it interacts with the collider objects. It's becoming a more gloopy, glue-like paint. And then if I increase the surface tension, this is going to have it's almost going to double that impact. So what surface tension does, it tells the fluid to try and come together into an object which has the least surface area possible. So you get much more blobby stuff. So I'm just going to show you a scene which will actually demonstrate that a lot better, because it's a really great, cheap technique. So in this scene, what I've got is a square emitter, a cube emitter, emitting these particles. So you see they start as a cube, and then as it plays, you see they get kind of blob into a sphere. And that's the surface tension working to try and make it have as little surface area as possible, and it makes a sphere. So this is the cool thing. For kind of, if you want to do like a microscopic render or demonstrate liquid in a kind of a more weightless environment, what we can do in the fluid data is just stick that surface tension right up, put a turbulence in there, and what we're going to get, the turbulence is trying to force the particles apart, but the fluid solver and the surface tension is going to try to keep them together and create these spheres. And then they'll break apart, and we get this really nice kind of gluey snapping. And this is running in real time in the viewport, so it's a very light sim, and we get this really nice effect. And the only other thing I've done to try and keep them from flying off is we can activate an attractor, which is a modifier, which is almost like pulls them in. And you can see here that we've got this working with Cinema 4D R20's fields now. So in the fall-off tab, I've got a spherical field and an invert. And all this is saying is, inside this inner sphere, if the particles are inside this inner sphere, the attractor is having no impact on them at all. And as the particles move into the fall-off, they'll start getting attracted back into the center. And you just get this nice, languid push and pull, kind of organic, blobby-looking animation, which I actually just built this to try and demonstrate what surface tension meant. And I thought, happy accident. It's quite a nice, simple technique. Okay, cool. So what else we can do with fluids, I mentioned with that really nice render that you saw of the sand, we can do granular, which we can get some stunning results. Now this is a pre-cached scene. This is the only pre-cached scene I'm going to play you. But here we have got 3 snowballs with different granular settings given different types of grains. So obviously on the left-hand sphere, it's much more like dry sand. The middle sphere is the most clumpy, and then the right-hand one is kind of like a mixture between the two. And this is pre-cached, so there are 150,000 particles in this scene, so 50,000 per snowball, and it took 9 minutes to cache the whole scene, 150 frames, which is not the end of the world. For production, you'd want a higher particle count, as always with this stuff, but it still works pretty well. What I like about these, if you follow the path of this one here, we'll see that it breaks into another bit, smashes, and then the following one then crumples in, and obviously it's all interacting with each other. And if you look at this one, I really like, if you keep your eye on, follow the path of this, as it disintegrates, it leaves a trail behind it as it gradually gets smaller and smaller. And these types of effects obviously can be done with the old fracturing techniques, with Voronoi fracture, and then maybe emitting particles behind to fake that kind of dissipation and disintegration. But what grains do is give you that real world solve, which gives you a bit of added realism. All right. So what I'll demonstrate now is, again, mixing solves. So what I've got in this scene, I'm going to switch off. I've got 3 emitters. One is going to produce some water, which is going to slosh about in the object. And so what I've got a gravity modifier in the scene, which is making the particles fall to the bottom of the cube as they would in the real world. And then I've got a wind pushing them across this side. And I've actually got the control just to tell the wind to push only the particles on the surface of the water. Because in the real world, the whole volume of the ocean isn't being pushed by the wind. It's just the water particles on the top. And we have that control in xParticles to be able to do it. So that's that. Now I have got a snow emitter coming in. Now I've got this running at quite low resolution because I want it to play in real time for you. So this is set to water. Then I've got an emitter set to grains, and it's being pushed around and floating on the top because it has different physical properties. And if it was a higher particle count, higher res, it would look more clumpy and more realistic. But we can see it floating on the surface. And then what I've got is I've got a sand one, and the sand is similar to the snow. It's a granular solve, but I've given it a massive density value. So what should happen is it should sink really quickly into the water because of that higher density, causing a nice splash. So let's have a look. So here comes the sand. So it disperses that water as it pushes its way through. We get a really nice splash, and then it settles and sinks to the bottom of that water volume. And then let's include the snow. So what should happen now is the snow should land on the top, kind of smash apart into slush and float, and then be crushed by the sand with the high density value. So all interacting in the same scene. We've only got one FluidFX solver in there, that's the physics, and then we set all these different parameters getting different shapes with the particle values. And I haven't got a scene for it, but the density trick's really good. You can get liquids with different densities interacting with each other. So you can have oil floating, being poured into water, so it'll initially sink as it pours in and then float to the surface. And it's there's loads of really cool mixtures of these solves that we can do. So instead of just showing you pre-made stuff, I want to build some of a scene in front of you to show you how we can set these up relatively easily. Now, I'm doing this at low resolution, at lower particle counts, and that's so I can build it and so it'll run in real time. For production, you do higher particle counts, and you won't get as speedy viewport performance. So let's just look once more at. We'll have a look at recreating this. This is another one of Mario's scenes. So this is a granular solve, as we said. And he set up the sand in exactly the same way that I've demonstrated, but it's being advected, it's been moved by the velocity information created by a smoke and fire explosion. So two different solvers working together. And it's pretty easy to set up. Okay. So in this scene, here is my xParticles logo, which is just a piece of geometry. And what I want to do is I want to fill that geometry volume with particles that are in a static state, and that's going to be our granular body. So all we have to do is have an xParticles emitter, and instead of it being a box or a circle, we can actually say emit from an object. So in the emitter shape, we select object, and we drag in the XP logo object. So now this is going to work as our particle emitter. So now, if I go to my emission, this is really important. I need to set the emission mode to hexagonal. And that's important because what it'll do, let me just create the particles. What hexagonal has done, it's taken the volume of that geometry and it has used a hexagonal grid to perfectly birth particles so there is no gaps between them and no intersections. And that's really important with fluid solves, that you don't have intersecting particles because it'll mess around with the density and they'll explode and you'll lose the solve. So this is a really efficient way of starting with a very good body of particles. So that's our start. I've got it set to have no speed, obviously, because we just want the particles to be static, and they're emitting on one frame. So there we go, that's our particles. So that bit's pretty simple. So we've got a FluidFX body in there, and the FluidFX is going to be making them granular. So the only thing we need to do is go to the emitter grains, to the extended data tab, and just say turn it to granular. I want to have 100% friction, which is going to make them really kind of clump together, and we'll leave it at these settings for now. Okay. Now I've turned on my FluidFX solver, pressed play, and nothing's happening. There's no fluid-like motion or no granular. And that's because there are no forces affecting these particles yet. Nothing is making them move, so we can't see that they're fluids or grains. Now, normally in a granular sim, you'd always use gravity because you want them to smash on the floor. But we're going to do something different in this render. We're going to use the force made by an explosion to push them around. So let's make the explosion. So the explosion, we are going to use our fire solver, which is called xpFluidFX. And what that does, if we bring that one of those into our scene, it brings in this surrounding box, which has a grid on the back. And the fire has to take place within this grid. So we have the grid, and here's the object. And I won't go through all of the settings because there are a lot, but it gives you so much control over the shape of your fire explosion. But we won't go into that today. It's not the right time. So how do we get fire? We need to tell that domain that we want something to blow up. So we're going to use particles to blow it up. So I have got another emitter here, and it's set to be this box. And if I press play, let's just switch off the grains. So that's all we've got. We've got a box emitter emitting these green particles, and they're traveling up on the y-axis. They've got varying speeds, so it looks a little bit random. And what we need to do is tell xpFluidFX these particles have fuel on board, and we want to ignite that fuel and make an explosion. So the way we do that is similar to giving a particle fluid values. We go to the particle, extended data, physical data, and we want to give it some fuel. So I'll give it 2 fuel. And the last step, so it can communicate with our xpFluidFX, is to give it this emitter source tag. Just got tags, xparticles tags, xpFluidFX source, and that's it. So now if I hit play, those particles, the fuel is being ignited, and it's making a smoke and fire sim. Now I've got this display of the sim set to very low resolution, so it plays well. So it looks a bit blurry and a bit blobby. But you can, of course, make that look better. So if you go to the xpFluidFX, go to the display, various different ways of visualizing the simulation. At the moment, the display is set to the smoke and fire, but I can set it to the temperature values of the sim. We can increase the resolution of just the display by upping these values, but that'll give you poorer viewport performance. We can look at all sorts. And this is the key channel that we're creating in this simulation is velocity. And we'll look at that velocity. There's the velocity data. And we're going to use that velocity data to push our sand around. That's what we're going to harness. So I'm just going to, well, actually, we don't need to view this anymore. We know it's happening. It's in the scene. That's working. Now what we need to do is tell it to move around these particles. And we can see that it's pushing them up, and they're moving along with that velocity information caused by the explosion. And that's happening because in the xpFluidFX object, we have got particle advection switched on. And what we've got is velocity set to 100%, so it's passing that velocity information into the particles, making them move and crack apart. So then all we have to do is put our FluidFX solver back on to make them behave like grains. And they should start cracking in clumps and moving up. And it's working pretty nicely. So that's mixing the two different solvers together. But we can also control that very easily in xparticles. So if I just go back to the video, if you notice, the explosion obviously is coming from below and pushing them up. But if you look at the animation, the destruction is actually starting from the top and making its way down. So that's happening counter to the way in which that explosion's working. And that's what I think makes it look such a kind of eye-catching scene. So the way we're going to do that is using some of the control tools we've got in xparticles. And we're going to use something called groups. So if you're an xparticles user and you don't use groups much, I'd urge you to practice because they give you so much power and control over your animations. So I'm going to go to my grains emitter, groups, and I'm going to create a group. And this group, I'm just going to give it another color so it'll be obvious. So all that's going to happen is when I press play, the particles are going to be put in the purple group. And everything else is going to work exactly the same. It's going to advect, and it's doing the same thing. But this is the key. I can tell xpFluidFX only to advect particles in specific groups. So let's build on. I'm going to make a new group, And this one I'm going to, let's make it, like, I don't know, orangey. And I'm going to make circles. So I'm going to go to xpFluidFX, into the advection, and you see I've got a groups option here. I'm just going to put in particle group 2. Let's just change that to a very different color. So now Xplosion is only going to advect particles in particle group 2. So if I hit play, they're not advecting anymore because they're in particle group 1 and we haven't put any particles in group 2, so they don't exist and there's no advection. So now what we can do is use a tool to artistically transfer particles from group 1 into group 2, and as they go into group 2, they'll then start to advect. And we can use the new R20 fields to do this. So what I'm going to do is go to my Modifiers menu, and I'm going to go to Control Modifiers, and we've got a Change Group modifier. Bring it in. And there's two things we need to do. We need to tell it which group to affect. So we want to affect particle group 1, and we want to put them into new group, particle group 2. And by default, it'll just happen immediately. So if I press play, they're immediately getting put in particle group 2, and they're starting to advect. But we want to transition them into particle group 2, and we want control over that. And that's where we're going to use a field. So we'll go to the fall off tab, and we'll pick, I'll just use a box field. And let's move this up. So what this is saying is, if the particles are inside this inner square, they will be put into particle group 2. And if they are outside of it, they will remain in particle group 1. So I'm just going to change the fall off by remapping. They're really intuitive, these new remapping tools. They're excellent. So we'll do that. And that's all we need to do. So now if I hit play, they're in particle group 1. And if I animate this field, it transfers them into particle group 2 and they start to advect. So all you need to do is keyframe this field on the Y. So we'll start it there, add a keyframe, another keyframe. What have I done? What am I doing? Oh, hang on. Let me just delete all that because I'm doing something wrong with my keyframes. My brain's not working. Anyway, if we keyframed it, we would get that, and it would automatically come down like this, start to advect, and that is exactly the technique that Mario used in that scene. So the final render, although it looks incredibly detailed and the movement all looks very complex, actually the control of it is pretty simple, and it's the magic of the physics solvers that is giving us that really nice kind of fluid motion, pretty much for free. I mean, it feels like you're cheating sometimes playing around with this stuff. Okay. So let's have a look. So we've used xpFluidFX for the velocity, and we've mixed it with a grain solve. Let's recreate another scene. And this one is this really nice smoke and fire that I played at the beginning. So this is slightly different. Traditionally in Cinema 4D, it was quite tricky to have really close control over what you emit fire from and growing it. And there were certain ways of kind of masking fuel channels to get it to go in the way, but it was a bit hit and miss, and it wasn't that art directable. But now we can ignite fluid and get fire from it, which is really easy and incredibly useful. So what I'm going to do is, let's just do this one from scratch. So what I'm going to do is build a basic container with a mold in it. So we'll start with a cube, and we'll bring in a torus and scale that down. And what we're going to do is use our open VDB mesher to quickly make a mesh out of this. So we'll go to generators, open VDB mesher, and I just need to drag my two objects in. make the original objects invisible, because we're going to mesh them. So at the moment, you can see that it's set to union, so it's just made a mesh out of both. All I need to do is go to my torus and just set it to difference. And it's a bit big. So it'll update live. So there's our channel. Let's make this cube a bit fatter, I think. Okay. And it's a bit kind of voxelized here because our voxel size is quite big. So I'll just put that down to say 2. And then we want to smooth out these edges. So we'll add let's add a Gaussian. And I'll put the width down to make it sharper. So there's my mesh. And I'm the world's worst modeler. And that, if I was doing it without our mesher or with the new volume builder in Cinema, that would take me probably 2 days. So let's just make that current state to object. Switch that off. And that's going to be my mesh. So this is going to be filled up with fluid that we're going to set on fire, this channel here. So what we need to do is make this mesh, let's move it down. We need to tell it to collide with particles, otherwise the particles will just go through them. So to do that, we will go to tags, xparticles tags, and we'll stick a collider tag on there. Let's take I'll leave it as default for now. So now I'm going to get an emitter. This is going to emit particles. And by default, it'll emit green particles in the Z direction. And if I move it down, it'll start bouncing off this because we've made it a collision object. So that's where we're going to start our water from. Let's just add a few more frames to the scene. So let's change the shape of this from a rectangle to a circle. And I'm going to scale this circle size way down to something like that. So this is going to be our stream of fluid. And let's put some gravity in. So we'll go to xparticles, modifiers. We want to change the motion of those particles, so it'll be a gravity motion modifier. That comes in, hit play, and they're being forced to the ground, and then they're interacting with our object. So if I then bring in a xparticles dynamic objects FluidFX, this is our fluid solver, these will start behaving like a fluid. Not looking right yet, but we're getting there. So there's our fluid, kind of. So here's a tip with fluids. If you ever want to create a fluid simulation where the pour is really important, so pop coming out of a can or beer out of a bottle or tea being poured out of a pot, and you need a nice accurate pour before it becomes the pool, never just use an emitter on its own. Because in the real world, water particles don't just appear from thin air and fall to the ground. They are always poured from something. And it's important to have that spout to give you the correct movement. So I'm just going to do a very basic one. Let's do a tube. And we'll do it on the, what do we need? The plus Z, yeah? So this is going to be our spout. So it's way too big, obviously. So this wants to be similar to, I'm just going to eyeball it because we haven't got that much time. Let's move it up. And we want it to be, we want the emitter to be kind of in the end of it. And then we'll bring this inner radius down so it's just a little bit wider than the emitter. So this is going to be our tube. Let's make the emitter a child of the tube. And then now obviously we can move, oh no, wrong one. We can move this around and the emitter's going to stay where it is. So let's move this into the area, rotate it down. And of course we need a collider tag on the tube. Otherwise the particles are just going to fly through it. So we can just hit Control and copy that one onto the tube. So they're coming out. Still not looking right, but there is our flow. And we've got got a bit of leakage. So in the emitter, we're going to change it. Remember we did that hexagonal emission mode for the grains to make it a really efficient, unintersecting emission. Let's do that for this as well. And I'm going to reduce the radius to have more particles. And reduce it more. Oh, 1, not 10. There we go. And we can reduce this speed. And we can add a little bit of friction, no bounce. And let's move my tube nearer to our area. And now we're starting to get something that's looking like the fluid should. In our emitter, I'm just going to change the display mode. So at the moment, every particle is just being born green, and it doesn't look very fluid-like. And that's because it's a single color. But I can change this and color them via a gradient. So now I've got a blue to white gradient, and I can assign which parameter that gradient is being assigned to. So if I color them according to the particle's speed, what this is saying is particles that are very slow are going to be blue, and particles that are very fast are going to be white. And as a result, you get a more fluid look. And if I change the display to, say, circles filled, now we're starting to see that it's looking a little bit more like our fluid. And if you wanted to, we've got loads of control over this fluid. We can just leave it as it is, really. But if we wanted to have some more random movement, we can add another motion modifier, like a turbulence. And this is going to start making it move a bit more erratically, giving it a bit of movement. You see, it's kind of, the turbulence is pushing it around, and we're getting more splashes as that turbulence is animating. And if I put that up really high, it obviously is making it go wild. But you can see the effects of the turbulence pushing those particles around. So obviously way too much. In fact, we'll just turn the turbulence off because we don't need it. All right. So that's our basic fluid sim. Then how do we start? Well, let's mesh it first before we do the fire. So fluids, what you do with it is you simulate the particles first, you mesh those particles to give you geometry, and you render the mesh. And we'll use our XP Open VDB Mesher to do that. So let's go to Generators, VDB Mesher, and all we need to do is drag the emitter into the mesher. So let's drag the emitter into the source, and it makes this blobby source. So we need to reduce the point radius, which is like a radius around each particle, and it's too high. Bring down the voxel size. We'll make the particles invisible. And we could smooth this and make it look nicer, obviously, for production. But there we have got a mesh. It's generating in real time, creating nice quads. Let's make it. And there we've got our, look at that, realistic lava or what. But there we go, and this mesh is being generated in real time. It's making quads, and it's moving pretty quickly. So very nice kind of visualization. Okay, let's just switch the mesh off for now. So I've just been throwing these xParticles objects into this scene, and it's suddenly the scene is not very organized, is it? And if you imagine if you were building this on your own, and you had 50 xParticles objects, and you handed it over to another artist, they'd be like, what on earth is this mess? Because it becomes quite difficult to read. So we've got a new tool in the latest release, which is fantastic just for that. So all of these xParticles objects are in our object manager. And if I want to sort them, I just go to the xParticles menu and go XP System Sort. And it automatically puts all of the xParticles objects into these subfolders. So we've got a folder for dynamics with our FluidFX. We've got a folder for our emitter, our generators, our meshes are in there, and our modifiers have been put in here. And suddenly, we've got all our xParticles items in a really organized system. So then another artist gets it, they can read the scene and find out how you've done it. So it's a super useful technique. Right. So let's create fire from our fluid. So we need our smoke and fire solver. So if we go to the dynamics menu that was created for us, we can go to this dynamics objects and choose the one we want. And we want an xpFluidFX, which puts it into our system. So now we have got our exposure grid. This is where the fire is going to be solved inside here. So I can move it up. And it's always a good idea. The fire is solved adaptively, so it doesn't try and solve the entire grid. It just tries to solve the areas which it needs, which makes it quicker. But it's always a good idea to try and kind of change the bounds of the grid to make it as small as you can get away with. And usually you'll get a more efficient solve. All right, so now what we need to do is tell the xpFluidFX grid where's the fuel coming from, how are we going to make this fire? And this is the beauty. Because we made our liquid out of particles, we can just put an exposure tag on the particles and make fire from them. So we'll get our emitter, we'll get tags, xparticles tags, and put an xpFluidFX source. And the only other thing we need to do is give it some fuel. So go into the emitter, extended data, physical data, and put, let's just say, 2 fuel again. And just hit play on the defaults. Have I moved my emitter? Okay, so by doing the XP system sort, I have unparented the emitter from my tube. So be careful of that gotcha. What I'll do is I'm going to put my tube into there, and then I'm going to select my emitter, and I need to reposition it back into the tube. Otherwise, it's not going to react correctly. So bear that one in mind when using XP system sort. Okay, let's start again. So now the particles for our fluid are emitting fire. They're moving their way around, and we're getting a fire simulation in our sim. Now, there's a couple of errors, aren't there? We have got fire intersecting this tube. Now, what you can do, obviously, is set up a collider object on that tube to prevent the smoke from escaping. But here's another bit of advice. If you can ever avoid doing that, do, because it'll make your fire solves way quicker. Fire having to solve for colliders is very heavy on the processor, because it's having to make so many calculations. So for this scene, I'm going to do, what I like to do is a lazy cheat, and I'm going to change the art direction and make it a sliced gully. And then I don't have the problem. So the last thing I want to show you, so there's our scene. And it's okay, but we can have more control. Now you can see that the fuel is igniting immediately because every particle has got a fuel value, and as soon as it gets in the exposure area, it makes the fire. But what if we want the fire to only start igniting once we get down to about this bit? Well, we can do that. We can control it. So what we're going to do, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to go in the emitter and I'm going to remove all of that fuel data that I gave it. Let's put it to 0. So now it can't emit any fire because it's not got any fuel data. It's not going to work. And I'm going to use a modifier to give it the fuel, and then I've got control over when it happens. So if I go to modifiers, and I'm going to go to control, and I'm going to control the physical properties of the particle. And I can go to fuel, set the fuel value, and I'm going to set it at 2. So now this should behave in exactly the same way as I did before. It should just emit fuel straight away because the modifier is given it, and there it is. So here's the cool thing. We can control it by mapping this data. I'm going to go to the mapping tab, add a map. This is within the physical modifier. And what I'm going to say is, take the fuel value, which I've set here as 2, and put it in this F-curve. So the fuel value is on this y-axis. So here it has a fuel value of 0, and here it has a fuel value of whatever you've defined here, which is 2. And this x-axis is whatever parameter you choose here. So if I put age and put, say, 30 frames, what it's saying is, at frame 0, it has 0 fuel in the particle, and when a particle becomes 30 frames old, it has the value of 2. So I'm just going to make it obvious by putting it up here. So now what should happen, the fuel starts at this point. Now, because we've got the water is behaving like fluid and some of it's sloshing back, we're still getting some smoke at the top of the sim, but you can see it's there, it's appearing. after this 30 frame value. And data mapping is, I said earlier on, if you don't use groups, then start learning and utilizing the use of groups in your X-particle scenes. Data mapping also gives you so much control over the manipulation of your particles. And all of these, so I'm using age, but look at all of these different data sets that we can use to affect how modifiers change particles' movement. It's this almost limitless. It's fantastic. And so that's the basic setup. And that is the technique that Mario used to create this render. So what I want to do is just shut this one down and show you a different version which has a breakdown at the end of it, which displays some other techniques that was used. So here is the render in question, all of the same, exactly the same techniques that I've just demonstrated for you. And then you'll see a breakdown with the individual parts. So here is this fluid sim. Meshed with our VDB mesher, set on fire with xpFluidFX, and all of this was rendered in Cycles 4D. So there's the smoke and fire pass. We've got the sparks pass. Now this is a really interesting technique. So remember we talked about there was the kind of the molten metal that then had congealed on the mold in the render. So the way Mario did that was we've got a particle paint tool, which means you can get a mesh, you can create an emitter, and you can paint particles onto the surface, and it'll respect the surface normals of that mesh. So you can paint them over any part of a mesh. You can define the color, the radius, how big, how small, the age, if they disappear or not, if they grow on, and then you can mesh those with the open VDB mesher. And if you have it all selected, you can actually paint them on in real time, and it gives you fantastic artistic control over where you want those particles. And here we can see the result of that. So obviously much higher resolution, but we've got these wireframe kind of blobby, recongealed bits of steel done by painting it. We can put complete artistic control over where those are put on. And here are the wipes with the various different parts of the render. And so 3 or 4 years ago, you'd be able to produce something like that, obviously, but you'd probably use three different pieces of software, or at least multiple plugins to have to do various different elements in the same scene. But now with the latest xParticles 4 working inside of Maxon's R20, there's a massive amount that motion designers and even VFX designers can do inside one application without having to move around. So it makes it hugely quick and hugely versatile. So that's pretty much it from demonstrating the techniques, but I just wanted to announce that if you are already an xParticles user and you have xParticles 4, which was the one we released before Christmas time last year, the brand new update will be available as of next week, which is the update which will work in Cinema 4D R20. This will initially be released as part of our beta early access program, which everybody has access to if you're an xParticles customer. So you go to our website, Insydium.limited, and it's all the information on how you get it. But that will be released as of next week, so you can use it in R20. And then there will be a full release production build released on the 1st of November, which is obviously fully supported. It'll be used in render farms, offline capabilities, and that release with the R20 compatibility will be ready the 1st of November. If you're not an xParticles user and you're interested, there's a free trial of a month, fully functional trial, so you can install it, have it working, loads of free tutorials on our YouTube channel as well to get you started. So I'd urge you to go to our website, get that detail, and get up and running, because once you've tried it and you've got hooked, it's like crack. There's no going back. Right. Thanks very much.